May 5, 1821, 5:49 p.m. A converted barn on a volcanic rock 1,200 miles from the nearest land. 28 people watching a man die. The man was Napoleon Bonaparte, once Emperor of France, once master of Europe from the Atlantic to Russia, once commander of 685,000 soldiers. Now, bloated, yellow-skinned, vomiting black bile, gasping for breath in a damp room that reeked of death. From 70 million subjects to 28 witnesses, Count Henri Gratien Bertrand held one hand, Charles Tristan de Montauban held the other. Around them, British doctors, British officers, British soldiers, French servants. Everyone wanted to see the end. His breathing stopped. 30 seconds of silence, then restarted. Rattling. Wet. Dr. Arnott checked for pulse. Fading. Minutes left, maybe less. Outside, wind howled across the plateau. Rain hammered the windows. The South Atlantic crashed against cliffs 600 feet high. This was how empire ended. Not with a final charge. Not with a dramatic last stand. Just an old man dying slowly while the weather raged. But here's what makes this death matter 200 years later. This didn't start 6 years ago when they brought him here in chains. It started 9 years ago in Russia, when Napoleon made a decision that would kill 645,000 soldiers and doom his empire. And it won't end here, because Napoleon understood something his captors didn't. You can imprison a body, you can't imprison a story. And the story he was about to leave behind would prove more powerful than any army he'd ever commanded. This is how a defeated emperor won the only war that matters. The War for Memory, June 1812, the Niemen River. The eastern edge of Napoleon's empire. 685,000 men stood ready to cross into Russia, the largest army ever assembled in European history. Frenchmen, Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch, Swiss, Spaniards. An army of nations bound together by Napoleon's ambition and the promise of glory. Napoleon sat on his horse at the riverbank, watching engineers construct pontoon bridges. He was 42 years old, at the absolute peak of his power. Master of Europe, Emperor of France, King of Italy, protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. His brothers ruled Spain and Westphalia. His marshals governed Holland and Naples and Sweden. From where he sat, he could see the future stretching before him. Forced Tsar Alexander to accept the continental system, seal off Britain's trade, bring the British to their knees without ever crossing the Channel. Then perhaps Constantinople, perhaps India. The world had no limits for a man who'd already conquered everything he'd touched. What Napoleon didn't know, what he couldn't know sitting there watching his grand army cross into Russia, was that he'd already lost. Tsar Alexander had made his decision months ago, sitting in his palace in St. Petersburg. No negotiations, no matter what. Let Napoleon come. Let him march into the vastness of Russia. Let the distances and the weather and the scorched earth do what armies couldn't. Alexander's generals had prepared the strategy. Retreat. Burn everything. Leave Napoleon nothing to capture, nothing to supply his army, nothing to negotiate over. Draw him deeper and deeper into Russia until the sheer weight of distance crushed him. Napoleon had no idea. He thought he was marching to a quick victory, a decisive battle, a treaty signed by autumn. He thought Russia would fight like Austria had, like Prussia had, like every other continental power that had faced the Grand Army. Meet him in battle, lose, accept terms. He was wrong about everything. Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier stood near Napoleon, studying maps spread across a portable table. 59 years old, he'd been Napoleon's chief of staff since the Italian campaign in 1796. 16 years of victories, 16 years of watching Napoleon pull off impossible maneuvers and win battles that should have been losses. But Berthier had doubts now. He kept them quiet, but they gnawed at him. The army was too large. Supply lines would stretch across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Russians wouldn't fight a set-piece battle. They'd retreat, and the Grand Army would chase them deeper and deeper into a country that could swallow armies whole and never notice. The words came out carefully, diplomatically. "Sire, The distances? Napoleon cut him off with a wave. The Russians will fight to defend Moscow. They always do. We'll force a battle, crush them, dictate terms. 3 months, 4 at most. Berthier said nothing more. There was no point. When Napoleon decided on a course of action, argument only irritated him, and Berthier was tired. 59 years old, longing for his estate in Bavaria, for retirement, for peace. In 3 years, Berthier would throw himself from a window in Bamberg, unable to bear the weight of watching Napoleon's empire collapse. Unable to choose between loyalty to the man he'd served for 16 years and loyalty to the Bourbon kings who'd reclaimed France. But that was 3 years away. Now he watched the Grand Army cross the Niemen River, and he kept his doubts to himself. What happens when loyalty conflicts with judgment? When you know the cause is wrong, but can't bring yourself to abandon it? Berthier was about to spend 3 years learning the answer, and it would destroy him from the inside. By the end of the first week, 130,000 men were gone, not from battles, from disease, desertion, exhaustion, heat stroke. 20% of the invasion force evaporated before a single major engagement. The army marched through Lithuania toward Vilna. Temperatures soared above 90 degrees. Men collapsed on the road. Horses died by the thousands, bloated corpses lining the route like milestones. Supply wagons broke down on roads turned to mud by summer thunderstorms. Jean-Baptiste Barré, a soldier in the 47th Line Infantry, wrote in his diary, "We march 20 miles each day and see no Russians, only abandoned villages, burned fields, empty barns. My company started with 140 men at the Niemen. We have 98 now. We haven't fired a shot." The pattern established itself in that first week. Napoleon pushed forward, chasing a Russian army that refused to stand and fight. His own army melted away behind him, dissolving into the vastness of Russia like salt into water. By August, 450,000 remained of the original 685,000. Still no major battle. The Russians retreated toward Moscow, burning everything in their path. Napoleon grew frustrated. He needed a decisive victory. He needed the Russians to surrender so he could turn his attention back to Europe, back to Spain, where British forces under Wellington were slowly pushing his brother Joseph back to the continental system that was supposed to be strangling Britain, but instead was driving European states to quiet rebellion. September 7, 1812, the village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. The Russians finally stopped retreating. General Mikhail Kutuzov, 67 years old and so fat he could barely mount a horse, had decided to make a stand. Not because he thought he could win, but because the Russian court and the army and the people demanded it. You couldn't just abandon Moscow without a fight. Politically impossible. So Kutuzov chose his ground, a series of ridges and earthwork fortifications called flèches protecting the main road to Moscow. He positioned 120,000 men and 640 cannons, and he waited. Napoleon had 130,000 men and 587 cannons. Finally, a battle. Finally, the set-piece engagement he'd been chasing for 3 months. The battle began at sunrise with the largest artillery barrage in history up to that point. The sound could be heard 60 miles away in Moscow. For 12 hours straight, cannons fired without pause. Infantry charged fortifications, were blown apart, charged again. Cavalry swept across smoke-filled fields, colliding with Russian cavalry in swirling melees. By evening, 70,000 men lay dead or dying. The French captured the flèches, captured the central position, technically won the battle, but Napoleon made a mistake. Late afternoon, with the Russian center crumbling, Marshal Ney begged him to commit the Imperial Guard, the elite veterans held in reserve for exactly this moment. One more push would break the Russian army completely, turn tactical victory into total rout. Napoleon refused. Why? He was sick. Bladder problems, painful and distracting. His judgment clouded, and he was 1,200 miles from France with no reinforcements. The Imperial Guard was his last reserve. He couldn't risk them. Not yet. Not here. So he let the Russians retreat in good order. Let them pull back toward Moscow. Let them live to fight another day. Ney was furious but said nothing. What could he say? You didn't question the emperor. After the battle, Napoleon walked among the dead, bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep in places, French, Russian, indistinguishable in death. The smell of blood and gunpowder and open bowels. Horses screaming, men crying for water or their mothers or God. This was victory. Napoleon lost Russia the moment he crossed the Niemen. He just didn't know it yet. Victory would have required conquering winter, distance, and Russian patience. He could defeat armies. He couldn't defeat geography. 450,000 men had entered Russia. After Borodino, 130,000 remained. 71% casualties in 11 weeks, and they still hadn't captured Moscow. September 14th, 1812. The Grand Army entered Moscow. The city was empty. 270,000 civilians had evacuated. The shops were closed, homes abandoned. Governor Fyodor Rostopchin had issued orders before leaving. Burn everything. Remove all firefighting equipment. Leave the French nothing. That night, fires started across the city. By morning, Moscow was an inferno. The French army tried to fight the fires but had no equipment. They watched helplessly as 3/4 of the city burned. Napoleon established headquarters in the Kremlin, the only major structure to survive mostly intact. He sat in the Tsar's throne room, master of a burned-out shell of a city, waiting for Alexander to send envoys to negotiate. No envoys came. Days passed. Weeks. Napoleon sent letters to St. Petersburg, offering generous terms. No response. October arrived. Still no response. The first snow fell on October 13th. Napoleon finally understood. Alexander would never negotiate, would never accept his terms, would let Moscow burn, would let the Grand Army occupy ashes, would wait for winter to do what Russian armies couldn't. On October 19th, after 5 weeks in Moscow, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. 100,000 men left Moscow. 40,000 would make it back to friendly territory. 60% would die in the next 2 months. This was the beginning of the end. Though Napoleon didn't know it yet, he still had 3 years, 2 returns to power, 1 final battle, and 6 years of exile ahead. But the empire died in Russia. Everything after was just a slow collapse. The retreat was worse than any battle. First came the cold. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Men who'd marched to Moscow in summer uniforms froze to death on the road. Fingers, toes, ears, noses turned black with frostbite and fell off. Pierre Auvray, 19 years old. A conscript from Normandy who'd been drafted 4 months earlier, made it only 3 days. His regiment found him sitting by the side of the road on the morning of October 22nd, frozen solid in a sitting position, eyes still open. They left him there. No time to bury the dead, no energy to spare, just keep marching. Then came starvation. The army had expected to supply itself from Russian resources during the retreat, but the Russians had burned everything. No food, no forage for the horses. Men killed horses and ate the meat raw. Then they ate the leather from their boots. Then they ate nothing and kept walking until they couldn't anymore. Then came the Cossacks. Russian irregular cavalry who harassed the retreating columns constantly. They didn't engage in open battle. They swooped in, killed stragglers, disappeared into the forests. Again and again, day after day, the Grand Army disintegrated. By early November, what remained wasn't an army anymore, just a mob of starving, freezing, desperate men stumbling west, hoping to reach Poland before they died. November 26th to 28th, the Berezina River. This should have been the end. The river was partially frozen but not solid enough to cross on foot. Russian armies converged from north and south to trap the French against the river. Napoleon had one advantage: General Jean-Baptiste Blay and his 400 engineers. They'd saved their bridging equipment when every other unit had abandoned theirs. For 2 days and nights, Blay's engineers stood waist-deep in freezing water, constructing 2 pontoon bridges under fire. Most developed hypothermia. Most died within weeks from the exposure. But they built the bridges. 50,000 men crossed. Prince Józef Poniatowski, commander of the Polish Corps, drowned when his horse lost footing on the icy riverbank. Thousands more drowned or were crushed in the panic. 10,000 wounded left behind were massacred by Russians, but 50,000 made it across. By December 14, 1812, when the remnants of the Grand Army finally staggered into friendly territory, 40,000 remained of the original 685,000. 94% casualties. The largest military disaster in European history up to that point. Napoleon left the army on December 5th, racing ahead by sleigh to reach Paris before news of the catastrophe. He needed to raise a new army before his enemies realized how vulnerable he was. Behind him, Marshal Ney led the rearguard. They called him the bravest of the brave. He would be among the last to cross back into Poland, protecting the retreat with a handful of exhausted veterans. In 3 years, Ney would command troops sent to arrest Napoleon after his escape from Elba. He would see Napoleon on a road in southern France and experience something that would answer the question Berthier had faced. What happens when loyalty conflicts with duty? But that was 3 years away. Now he led frozen soldiers through Polish snow, trying to save something from the disaster. Napoleon reached Paris on December 18th. He immediately began raising a new army. He had a genius for propaganda, for shaping narratives. Within weeks, the Russian disaster was being portrayed as a tragedy of weather and distance, not command failure. The emperor himself had fought magnificently. The army had been betrayed by early winter. Europe didn't believe him. In 1813, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden formed a new coalition. They smelled blood in the water. Napoleon was vulnerable for the first time in a decade. Napoleon fought brilliantly through 1813, winning battles at Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden. But he couldn't replace losses fast enough. Each victory cost men he couldn't afford to lose. Each defeat brought his enemies closer to France. October 16, 1813, the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. Napoleon's forces, 195,000 men. Coalition forces, 380,000 men. For 4 days they fought. On the final day, Napoleon's Saxon allies defected in the middle of battle, turning their guns on the French. The Grand Army broke and retreated. Casualties, 73,000. Napoleon pulled back to France. For the first time since the Revolution, foreign armies invaded French soil. Through early 1814, Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, defeating larger forces repeatedly through superior maneuver. Military historians still study the campaign of 1814 as a masterpiece of defensive warfare. But brilliance couldn't overcome numbers. The coalition kept advancing, kept bringing fresh troops, kept pushing toward Paris. Napoleon's marshals started to doubt. They had families, estates, lives beyond war. They'd followed Napoleon for glory and wealth. Now they faced only grinding attrition and eventual defeat. Marshal Auguste de Marmont, one of Napoleon's oldest friends, defected to the coalition on April 4, 1814. The betrayal broke something in Napoleon. He'd been betrayed by allies, by nations, by circumstances, but not by his marshals, not by his friends. On April 6, 1814, surrounded by remaining marshals at Fontainebleau, Napoleon announced he would abdicate. Marshal Ney led the intervention. "We won't follow you anymore. It's over." The others agreed. 20 years of loyalty gone, not from cowardice, from exhaustion, from the knowledge that continuing meant destroying France itself. This is what happens when loyalty destroys you from the inside. Ney would spend the next year trying to reconcile duty to the Bourbons with loyalty to Napoleon. The conflict would tear him apart. Napoleon had 4 options. First, fight to the death, refuse abdication, launch a guerrilla war, burn France before surrendering it. Second, commit suicide. The Roman solution, die with dignity rather than face defeat. Third, accept exile and disappear into history as a defeated tyrant. Fourth, accept exile but treat it as temporary, rebuild, return. On April 11, 1814, Napoleon signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau. He would abdicate, retain the title of emperor, and receive sovereignty over the island of Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast, 27 miles long. The coalition powers congratulated themselves. They'd contained the Corsican ogre, exiled him somewhere small and harmless, where he could live out his days in comfortable irrelevance. They'd made the same mistake the British would make a year later. They thought exile would end the story. Elba should have been peaceful. The island had 12,000 inhabitants, 3 small towns, iron mines. Napoleon was given a house, an allowance of 2 million francs per year, a guard of 1,000 volunteers. He should have aged quietly into history. Instead, he planned 9 months on Elba, and Napoleon read every newspaper smuggled from France. He learned that King Louis XIV, restored to the throne by the coalition, was deeply unpopular. The French people resented foreign occupation. The army chafed under Bourbon officers who treated veterans of the Grand Army with contempt. Most importantly, France was still his army. The soldiers hadn't fought for the Bourbons. They'd fought for Napoleon, for glory, for the promise that merit mattered more than birth. They still wore his eagles on their standards. They still sang his songs. February 26, 1815. Night. The harbor at Porto-Ferraio, Elba's main town. Napoleon stood on the deck of L'Inconstant, a small brig. Behind him, 6 smaller vessels. Total force, 1,028 men and 4 cannons. With this, he would reconquer France. The British commissioner assigned to watch Napoleon was at a party on the other side of the island. The French guards were sympathetic. The ship slipped out of harbor at dusk. By the time anyone realized Napoleon was gone, he was halfway to France. March 1st, 1815. The French coast, Gulf of Juan, near Cannes. Napoleon landed with his tiny force. They marched inland immediately, avoiding coastal roads where royalist forces might intercept them. The question that would decide everything. Would they shoot him? Napoleon was gambling everything on the belief that French soldiers wouldn't fire on their former emperor. That loyalty to him outweighed loyalty to the Bourbons. If he was wrong, he'd be captured or killed in the first engagement. The whole enterprise would end in a roadside skirmish, forgotten by history. March 5th, 1815. Outside Grenoble. The 5th Regiment of the Line blocked the road. 500 soldiers commanded by royalist officers with orders to arrest Napoleon on sight. Napoleon dismounted, walked toward them alone. His guard tensed, hands on weapons. This was the moment, fire or fold. Napoleon stopped 20 paces from the regiment, opened his coat, exposing his chest. His voice carried across the silence. Soldiers of the 5th, I am your emperor. If any man would shoot his emperor, here I am. Nothing. Seconds stretched. Then one soldier lowered his musket, and then another. Then the entire front rank. Someone shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" The cry spread through the regiment like fire. Officers tried to maintain order, but their men were already breaking ranks, rushing forward, surrounding Napoleon. The 5th Regiment joined him. 1,028 became 1,128. The march to Paris became a triumphal procession. March 7, 1815. Marshal Michel Ney received orders from King Louis XIV. Take forces south, arrest Napoleon, bring him to Paris in an iron cage. Ney, who'd fought through Russia, who'd protected the retreat at the Berezina, who'd been called the bravest of the brave, departed Paris with 5,000 men. He meant to obey. He'd made his peace with the Bourbons, received titles and estates. He was done with Napoleon, done with wars, done with risking everything for one man's ambition. But as he marched south, desertion began. His soldiers heard Napoleon was coming. They remembered. 10 years of victories, 10 years of glory, 10 years when France dominated Europe, and they'd been part of something greater than themselves. By the time Ney's forces met Napoleon's near Auxerre, Ney had maybe 3,000 men left. The others had simply walked away. Ney rode forward to meet Napoleon. They faced each other on the road. 10 years of history between them. Russia, Leipzig, the abdication, the betrayal. Ney tried to speak, to explain, to justify his service to the Bourbons. The words tangled in his throat. His eyes filled with tears. The words came out broken, anguished. I tried to hate you. I told myself you destroyed France, that you had to be stopped. I tried. Napoleon said nothing, just looked at him. Ney's voice cracked. I can't do it. I'm sorry. He dismounted, knelt in the mud. His 3,000 soldiers cheered. This is what happens when loyalty conflicts with duty, when you know the cause might be wrong, but you can't bring yourself to abandon the man who gave your life meaning. Ney would carry this choice to Waterloo, and it would destroy him. The floodgates opened after that. All across France, units sent to stop Napoleon joined him instead. 5,000 became 10,000, became 25,000. March 20th, 1815. Paris. King Louis XIV fled to Belgium at midnight. By noon, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon believed Europe would accept his return. He'd learned from Russia. He'd learned from the mistakes of 1814. He'd return as a constitutional monarch, make peace with the coalition, rebuild France into a modern state. He was wrong again. The coalition powers declared him an outlaw, mobilized their armies. Wellington assembled British and Allied forces in Belgium. Blücher mobilized the Prussians. They would end this permanently. June 18th, 1815. A muddy field near the village of Waterloo in Belgium. Napoleon faced Wellington's army, 68,000 British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops positioned on a ridge. Napoleon had 72,000 French troops. Somewhere to the east, Blücher approached with 50,000 Prussians. The question was timing. If Napoleon could defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived, he'd split the coalition armies and have a chance. If the Prussians arrived first, he'd be outnumbered and destroyed. Everything came down to timing. The battle should have started at dawn. Napoleon had planned for dawn, but the ground was soaked from overnight rain. The artillery couldn't maneuver in the mud. He had to wait for the ground to dry enough for his cannons to deploy. 4 hours. He waited 4 hours. Those 4 hours waiting for mud to dry cost Napoleon everything. His throne, his freedom, his life. The empire ended because of weather. Those 4 hours decided the battle, decided the campaign, decided the fate of Europe. 11:30 a.m., the battle finally began with a massive artillery bombardment. For 6 hours, French forces battered Wellington's line. Infantry attacks, cavalry charges, constant pressure. Wellington's forces bent but didn't break. 2 p.m. Ney, desperate to break through, launched a massive cavalry charge, 5,000 horsemen against Wellington Center. The British infantry formed squares, solid walls of men with bayonets facing outward. The cavalry crashed against the squares like waves against rocks. Again and again, 6 charges, each one bloodier than the last. Ney's horse was shot from under him. He found another. That one was killed. He found another. 5 horses killed under him that day. He was trying to die, trying to atone for betraying Napoleon in 1814, trying to find death on the battlefield because living with the choice he'd made, abandoning duty for loyalty, was unbearable. He survived. 4:30 p.m. Prussian scouts appeared on the eastern flank. Napoleon had to win now or lose everything. He committed his final reserve, the Imperial Guard. 3,500 veterans, men who'd followed him since Egypt, since Italy, men who'd never retreated, never broken, the best soldiers in Europe. 7:15 p.m. The Imperial Guard advanced in tight columns through the smoke and mud. This was the last charge Napoleon would ever order, the last battle he'd ever command. In 30 minutes it would be over. In 4 days he'd abdicate. In 6 weeks he'd be a prisoner. In 6 years he'd be dead. But right now the Imperial Guard was advancing. And for 30 more minutes, Napoleon was still Emperor of France. Wellington's forces seemed on the verge of collapse. The British line wavered. Then at 15 paces, the British First Foot Guards rose from where they'd been lying hidden in the tall grain. They fired one massive volley. The front ranks of the Imperial Guard disintegrated. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard retreated. Someone shouted, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. Panic spread through the French army faster than fire through dry grass. If the Imperial Guard was retreating, the battle was lost. The army broke. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The Prussians hit the eastern flank minutes later. What had been a retreat became a rout. 25,000 French casualties. The Grand Army ceased to exist. Napoleon escaped the battlefield and returned to Paris. June 22, 1815. Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He had 4 options again. Fight to the death, suicide, accept exile and wait. This time, no returning. The coalition would make sure. He chose to surrender to the British, believing they'd give him asylum in England. Better the British than the Austrians or Russians, who might simply execute him. July 15, 1815. Napoleon boarded HMS Bellerophon. He thought he was negotiating the terms of asylum. He thought the British would treat him as a political refugee, give him a country estate, let him live out his days writing memoirs. The British had other plans. For 3 weeks, Napoleon lived on the Bellerophon, dined with British officers, charmed them with stories of his campaigns, discussed philosophy and literature and politics. July 24th. The ship anchored off Torbay on the English coast. Thousands of British civilians rowed out in small boats to catch a glimpse of the famous Bonaparte. They cheered. They called his name. They treated him like a celebrity, not a defeated enemy. Napoleon walked the deck, bowed, waved. He believed public opinion would force the British government to grant asylum. He was wrong one final time. August 4th, 1815. Admiral George Keith boarded the Bellerophon. He carried orders from the British government. Napoleon would not receive asylum in England. He would be exiled to St. Helena, a volcanic island in the South Atlantic, west 200 miles from the nearest land. Napoleon exploded. This was kidnapping. He was under British protection. He had rights as a political refugee. Keith's response was cold. "You're a prisoner of war. You have no rights except what we grant you." Napoleon spent the next 3 days writing furious protests, appeals to the Prince Regent, to Parliament, to the British people, all ignored. August 7, 1815. Napoleon was transferred to HMS Northumberland. 28 people agreed to follow him into exile. Count Bertrand and his family, Montholon and his wife, Las Cases and his son, Gorgo, Dr. O'Meara, household servants. Everyone who could abandon him did. Former marshals, former ministers, former friends. They had lives to rebuild, careers to resurrect under the restored Bourbons. 28 remained, August 8, 1815. The Northumberland departed for St. Helena. The voyage took 10 weeks. The first week, Napoleon stayed in his cabin, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. Depression swallowed him whole. Everything was gone. Everything he'd built across 20 years of campaigns, 2 decades of reshaping Europe, gone. By the 4th week, he emerged, started eating again, walked the deck, conversed with Admiral Cockburn and the British officers, performed. That's what he did. Performed the role of the noble exile, the tragic hero undone by fate and lesser men. Week 9. The South Atlantic. Empty horizon in every direction. Napoleon stood at the rail with Admiral Cockburn. The conversation turned to exile, to St. Helena, to what awaited him. Cockburn tried to be encouraging. "The island has a pleasant climate. The house is comfortable. You'll want for nothing." Napoleon's laugh was bitter. Except freedom, except purpose, except meaning. He stared at the endless ocean. The words came quietly, more to himself than to Cockburn. "A man can survive anything except irrelevance." October 15th, 1815. Dawn. A sailor's voice. "Land ho!" Napoleon rushed on deck. St. Helena rose from the ocean like a fortress wall. Sheer volcanic cliffs 600 to 700 feet high. Dark rock, no beaches visible from the sea. The entire island looked like a prison built by geology itself. Only one anchorage, Jamestown, a narrow valley cut into the cliffs. 500 buildings crowded into the valley, impossibly steep cliffs on either side. The British had fortified it like a medieval castle. Batteries of cannons pointed at the harbor. More batteries on the cliff tops. Napoleon studied the island through a telescope. The words came flat, emotionless. They chose well. October 17th. Napoleon disembarked at Jamestown. 3,000 British soldiers garrisoned the island, 3,000 men to guard one prisoner. The first few weeks he stayed in Jamestown, while his permanent residence was prepared. British officials treated him with distant courtesy. Watched him constantly. December 10th, 1815. Napoleon moved to Longwood House. Longwood sat on a plateau 1,800 feet above sea level, exposed to constant wind from the southeast trade winds. Originally a barn and summer house, hastily converted. The rooms were damp, wallpaper peeling, roof leaked. Wind rattled the windows night and day. Napoleon toured the rooms, counted them, calculated the space. His expression revealed nothing, but Bertrand saw his hands tighten. This was it. This was the empire reduced to its final form. A converted barn on a windswept plateau, miles of empty ocean in every direction, 3,000 soldiers watching his every move. Napoleon walked to a window. Outside, sentries paced. Beyond them, the plateau stretched away to cliffs and ocean. He stood there for a long time, silent. Bertrand approached quietly. "Sire?" Napoleon's reflection in the glass looked old. Older than 46 had any right to look. The words came so softly Bertrand almost missed them. "From here there is no escape except in how I'm remembered." He turned from the window, straightened. The performance began again. If they wanted to imprison him, fine. He turned the prison into a stage, his jailers into villains, his suffering into legend. He would lose every battle left to fight except one, and that would be enough. What Napoleon didn't know that December evening, the performance would last 6 years. The British would send a jailer specifically chosen to break him. His household would turn on itself. His body would betray him. He'd lose everything except the one thing that mattered. But first, he had to establish the routine, build the foundation, begin the war that would outlast all of them. Cracker December 1815. Longwood House. The first month. Napoleon established a routine immediately, not from discipline but from necessity. Without structure, the days would blur into meaningless succession. Without purpose, exile would become exactly what the British wanted: slow dissolution into irrelevance. He woke at 7 each morning, breakfast with Bertrand and Montholon, then dictation, hours of it, recounting campaigns, justifying decisions, shaping the narrative of his reign for posterity. Las Cases served as primary secretary, transcribing everything in detailed notes, hundreds of pages. The opening campaign in Italy, the Egyptian expedition, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Every battle dissected, every maneuver explained, every victory framed as the triumph of revolutionary principles over reactionary monarchies. This was the war that mattered now, the war for memory. The British allowed visitors occasionally. Ships stopped at St. Helena on routes to India or the Cape. Officers came to Longwood to glimpse the famous Bonaparte. Napoleon performed for them, charming, erudite, philosophical. He spoke of his love for France, his regret over the loss of life, his hope for liberal reform across Europe. Every visitor left convinced the British were punishing a defeated enemy with unnecessary cruelty. Napoleon shaped each conversation carefully, planting seeds that would grow into sympathy across Europe. January passed into February. The isolation deepened. 28 people living in close quarters, trapped together by circumstance and loyalty. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Madame Bertrand hated St. Helena with a fury that burned hotter each day. She'd followed her husband into exile out of duty, but resentment poisoned everything. She snapped at servants, argued with Napoleon, made everyone around her miserable with her constant complaints about the wind, the damp, the food, the isolation. Gourgaud developed an obsessive jealousy toward Montholon. He suspected Montholon of manipulating Napoleon, of positioning himself as the primary confidant while undermining others. The suspicion had no clear evidence but fed on itself in the hothouse atmosphere of Longwood. Napoleon watched the household dynamics with growing concern. He needed these people. They were his link to the outside world, his witnesses, his collaborators in constructing the legend. If they turned on each other or abandoned him, the isolation would become unbearable. March 1816. The weather turned worse. The southeast trade winds blew constantly, howling around Longwood with a sound like distant screaming. The dampness seeped into everything. Clothes never fully dried. Books grew mildewed. The wallpaper, a hideous green pattern, peeled from the walls in strips. Napoleon's health began to show the first signs of decline. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent pain in his right side, difficulty keeping food down some mornings. He dismissed it as the climate, the stress, the poor quality of the food. Dr. Barry O'Mara, the British naval surgeon who'd agreed to serve as Napoleon's physician, examined him and found nothing definitive. probably digestive issues from the radical change in circumstances. Rest and bland food. Napoleon ignored the advice and continued dictating memoirs 8 hours a day. April 14, 1816. Everything changed. The new governor arrived. Lieutenant General Sir Hudson Lowe stepped off the ship at Jamestown with orders from London that were explicit and uncompromising. Napoleon Bonaparte was the most dangerous prisoner in the world. Security must be absolute. Escape must be impossible. The prisoner must be contained until natural death ended the threat permanently. Lowe was 46 years old, a career military officer who'd spent most of his service in administrative and garrison roles. Not brilliant but competent, not cruel but inflexible, the perfect bureaucrat to enforce regulations without mercy. April 17th. Lowe visited Longwood for the first meeting with his prisoner. The confrontation began immediately over title. Lowe addressed him as General Bonaparte. Napoleon refused to respond. He was Emperor Napoleon. The British could exile him but couldn't strip his title. If Lowe wouldn't use the proper form of address, they had nothing to discuss. Lowe's response came stiff, formal. His Majesty's government recognizes no imperial title. You are General Bonaparte, a prisoner of war. Napoleon turned his back, dismissed Lowe as if he were a petty functionary beneath notice. The pattern established itself in that first meeting. Lowe would insist on regulations. Napoleon would resist. Neither would compromise. The next 5 years would be psychological warfare fought through bureaucratic procedure. Lowe implemented the regulations systematically. Regulation 1. Visual confirmation twice daily. A British officer must physically see Napoleon to verify he hasn't escaped. Napoleon refused. He wasn't a common criminal to be checked like livestock. He barred the doors to his rooms and let British officers wait outside for hours. May 3, 1816. Lieutenant Thomas Harrison arrived at Longwood for morning verification. Napoleon locked himself in his study. Harrison waited outside the door. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3. Harrison was 26 years old, Oxford educated, son of a magistrate. He'd expected to see a monster. Instead, he was standing in a hallway waiting for an old man to open a door. Harrison couldn't leave without visual confirmation. Those were his orders, but he couldn't break down the door. That would be an international incident. He waited 4.5 hours. Finally, Napoleon emerged, walked past him without acknowledgement, and disappeared into the garden. Harrison made his report. Prisoner visually confirmed 1:30 p.m. That evening, Harrison wrote to his father, I understand he must be guarded, but the daily verification? It feels like we're breaking him on purpose, and I'm not sure that's justice. His commanding officer would later reprimand him for sympathizing with the prisoner. Harrison served out his rotation and returned to England. He never spoke publicly about St. Helena, but his letters, published after his death in 1868, showed a young British officer struggling with what he'd witnessed. We won the war, he wrote in 1817, but I'm not sure we won honorably. Lowe was furious about the 4-hour wait, but helpless. The regulations said visual confirmation, not cooperative verification. If Napoleon wanted to turn it into torture for the British officers, he could. Regulation 2. Movement restrictions. Napoleon could move freely within 12 square miles around Longwood, but only with a British officer escort. Beyond that boundary, forbidden. Napoleon loved riding, had ridden almost daily since his youth. Now the British were telling him he needed a babysitter to leave his house. He stopped riding entirely. Let his horses grow fat in their stalls. Better to give up the pleasure than accept British supervision. Regulation 3. Correspondence censorship. All letters to and from Longwood would be opened and inspected. Any content deemed inappropriate would be blacked out or the letter confiscated. Napoleon began writing in code. Simple substitution ciphers, historical references only his correspondents would understand. The British censors caught maybe half of it. June 1816. Lowe ordered a fence built around Longwood's garden. Napoleon erupted. The fence made the prison visible, undeniable. Before, he could pretend the restriction was voluntary, that he chose to stay near the house. The fence destroyed the pretense. June 12th. Confrontation. Napoleon met Lowe in the garden as workers prepared to install the fence. The words came low, dangerous. "I am not a dog to be penned." Lowe's face remained expressionless. "The fence is for security. Your movements must be monitored." "Then monitor them, but I will not live inside a fence like an animal. The fence will be built regardless of your objection." Napoleon stared at him. 5 seconds. 10. The air between them crackled with mutual hatred. Two men locked in a battle neither could win, neither could abandon. Then Napoleon turned and walked back inside. He refused to use the garden for 4 months. Let the fence stand empty, a visible symbol of British petty tyranny. Every visitor saw it and understood. This wasn't necessary for security. This was punishment. Napoleon won the propaganda war through simple refusal. The British could build fences, implement regulations, restrict his movements, but they couldn't make him comply with grace. Every restriction became evidence of British cruelty. Every regulation became proof they feared him, even in defeat. Lowe thought regulations were walls that would contain Napoleon, but every regulation became a weapon Napoleon used against him. You cannot imprison someone's story, and the story was all Napoleon had left. August 1816. The budget war began. The British allocated $8,000 per year for Napoleon's household. For 28 people, this was insufficient. Food on St. Helena was expensive, shipped from Cape Town or England. Maintaining even basic dignity required funds Napoleon didn't have. He could have requested more from London. Lowe would have processed the request. But that would mean begging, and Napoleon would rather starve than beg his jailers for scraps. Instead, he began selling his possessions. Silver plate first, pieces from his campaign chest, gifts from conquered kings, relics of empire. One by one, they went to auction in London or Cape Town. Lowe recorded in his reports that the prisoner had adequate personal funds, omitting the fact that these funds came from liquidating everything Napoleon owned. September 1816. The Memoirs project intensified. Napoleon dictated 6 to 8 hours daily. Las Casas transcribed everything in shorthand, then converted it to longhand in the evenings. Hundreds of pages accumulated. The strategy was sophisticated. Napoleon wasn't writing objective history. He was constructing a narrative. France's revolutionary ideals threatened the old monarchies of Europe. They united to crush reform. Napoleon fought to defend progress against reaction. He lost militarily but won morally. It was propaganda, but propaganda mixed skillfully with truth. Napoleon had spread the Napoleonic Code, had promoted merit over birth, had challenged the divine right of kings. That he'd also crowned himself emperor and killed millions in pursuit of personal glory got buried under layers of revolutionary rhetoric. The memoirs weren't just Napoleon's revenge, they were his survival. Each page was proof that he still mattered, that his story deserved telling, that exile couldn't erase him. October 1816. The household continued to fracture. Gourgaud's jealousy toward Montholon festered. He became convinced Montholon was having an affair with Napoleon. No evidence, just suspicion fed by isolation and proximity. Madame Montholon, meanwhile, seemed unusually close to Napoleon. They took walks together, had long private conversations. Whether anything inappropriate happened was unclear, but the appearance was enough to fuel gossip. Bertrand tried to mediate, to keep the household functional, but even his patience wore thin. His wife's constant misery made life unbearable. His loyalty to Napoleon battled with his desire to escape St. Helena and return to France. Napoleon navigated these tensions with the skill he'd once used to manage coalitions of rival nations, flattering Gourgaud, confiding in Bertrand, keeping everyone close enough to be useful, but not close enough to threaten the fragile equilibrium. November 25, 1816. Disaster. British guards intercepted letters Las Casas was smuggling off the island. The letters contained uncensored accounts of life at Longwood, descriptions of British treatment, material for future publication. Guards burst into Las Casas's room at dawn, the sound of doors crashing open. Boots on wooden floors. Las Casas scrambled awake, heart pounding. The guards tore through his belongings. The smell of their sweat mixed with the musty odor of old papers. They found letters wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a false bottom of his trunk. Las Casas felt his main notebook, hundreds of pages, under his pillow. Tried to slide it beneath the mattress. Too late. A guard grabbed it, flipped through pages. His expression changed as he realized what he was holding. The taste of bile in Las Casas's throat. Fear. This wasn't just his exile ending. This was Napoleon's story being confiscated. But the guard focused on the letters. Missed a second notebook hidden in Las Casas's son's baggage. Lowe acted immediately. Las Casas was expelled from St. Helena. He could take his son, but nothing else. They departed December 3rd on the next available ship. Napoleon lost his most educated companion, his primary secretary, the man transcribing the memoirs that would shape his legacy. But Las Casas took his notebooks, 400 pages of detailed daily accounts that would become Memorial de Sainte Helene, published in 1823. What Las Casas was leaving with would change everything. Those notebooks would become the most influential book of the 19th century after the Bible. Notes that would shape how millions understood Napoleon. Lowe thought he'd contained a security breach. He'd actually ensured Napoleon's propaganda would reach Europe with even greater impact. December 3rd. Las Casas boarded the ship to Cape Town, then England. Napoleon watched the ship disappear over the horizon. His hand gripped the iron railing of the garden fence. The metal was cold. The wind was constant. The isolation was now complete. 23 people remained at Longwood, December 1816 into January 1817. Napoleon sank into depression after Las Casas's expulsion. He stopped dictating, stopped taking walks, spent days in bed, curtains drawn, refusing to eat. Bertrand grew alarmed. This wasn't grief over Las Casas. This was something deeper, the crushing weight of understanding that this was permanent. No escape, no reversal, just years and years of this until death. Montholon slowly coaxed him back, reminded him the memoirs mattered, reminded him that giving up meant letting the British win completely. By February, Napoleon emerged from the depression and resumed dictation. But something had changed. The performance required more effort. The mask slipped more often. March 1817. Gourgaud and Montholon's feud exploded. It started over something trivial, seating arrangement at dinner. Gourgaud felt Montholon manipulated Napoleon into slighting him. He confronted Montholon after the meal. The argument escalated. Accusations flew. Gourgaud claimed Montholon was a parasite positioning himself as primary heir. Montholon suggested Gourgaud's jealousy bordered on madness. Napoleon intervened before it became physical. But the damage was done. The household was poisoned. Madame Bertrand stopped speaking to Madame Montholon. The servants took sides. Every interaction became laden with tension. By early 1818, Gourgaud couldn't take it anymore. The combination of isolation, feuds, and Napoleon's dismissive treatment finally broke him. He requested permission to leave. Napoleon granted it coldly. March 1818. Gourgaud departed St. Helena. He left bitter, feeling betrayed. He'd followed Napoleon into exile out of loyalty and received nothing but neglect and insults. 19 people remained at Longwood, July 1817. The portrait incident. A painting arrived from Europe. Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, now 9 years old. A gift from sympathizers in Austria. Lowe demanded to inspect the portrait before allowing it into Longwood. Security regulations required examination of all items entering the prisoner's residence. Napoleon refused. It was a portrait of his child. The British had no right. Lowe insisted. Regulations were clear. The standoff lasted 3 months. The portrait sat in a customs warehouse in Jamestown, while Napoleon and Lowe fought through intermediaries. Finally, in October, Napoleon allowed the inspection under protest. The portrait contained no contraband, no hidden messages. It was simply a painting of a boy. But Napoleon had won another propaganda victory. Every newspaper in Europe reported the story. British so paranoid they wouldn't let a father receive a portrait of his son. November 1817. Dr. O'Mara's position became untenable. O'Mara was caught between two masters, officially employed by the British military, answerable to Lowe, but treating Napoleon, which required patient trust. Lowe suspected O'Mara of being too sympathetic to Napoleon. O'Mara's reports described genuine health problems, criticized Longwood's climate and conditions. Lowe interpreted this as political bias rather than medical assessment. The conflict escalated through early 1818. Lowe demanded O'Meara sign statements that Napoleon was exaggerating his illnesses. O'Meara refused, July 25, 1818. Lowe expelled O'Meara from St. Helena. Napoleon now had no doctor. Lowe offered British military physicians, but Napoleon refused to accept them. They answered to Lowe, not to their patient. He couldn't trust them. For the next 3 years, Napoleon would have no medical care beyond household remedies in his own judgment. This decision would cost him his life. December 1819. Madame Montholon departed, officially for health reasons. The climate didn't suit her. She needed to return to Europe for medical treatment. Rumors suggested she was pregnant. By her husband or by Napoleon was unclear and would remain unclear forever. She returned to France and didn't speak publicly about her time on St. Helena. 18 people remained. By early 1820, the pattern was established and unchanging. Lowe implemented petty regulations. Napoleon resisted through non-cooperation. The household slowly disintegrated from internal pressure. The outside world received accounts of British tyranny through letters and expelled companions. Napoleon was winning the propaganda war from his prison. Every restriction Lowe implemented fed the martyr narrative. Every household member who left took stories that made Napoleon sympathetic and the British look petty. But the victory came at a cost Napoleon was only beginning to understand. January 1820. The pain in his right side worsened, not constant anymore. Persistent, sharp when he moved certain ways, accompanied by nausea that came and went without pattern. He mentioned it to Bertrand but dismissed it as the climate, the stress, the isolation. He was 50 years old. Bodies hurt at 50, especially bodies that had spent 20 years on campaign, sleeping in tents, riding through snow and heat. Nothing to worry about, except it got worse. March 1820. He couldn't keep food down. Toast and broth, that was all his stomach would accept. Anything richer came back up within hours. His appearance changed. Weight gain in the abdomen, strange bloating that made him look pregnant. But his face grew gaunt, cheeks hollowing. His skin took on a yellowish tinge. Bertrand urged him to accept a British doctor. Napoleon refused. He didn't trust British physicians to treat him honestly. They'd probably poison him to hasten his death and spare Britain the expense of maintaining Longwood. The paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. Years of isolation, constant surveillance, bureaucratic warfare with Lowe. It distorted judgment, made conspiracy seem plausible, but refusing medical care was killing him faster than any poison could. July 1820. Napoleon looked 65. He was 51. His legs grew thin while his abdomen swelled larger. He moved slowly, carefully like an old man. The pain came more frequently now, sharp enough to make him gasp. He still dictated memoirs, but only a few hours daily. The rest of the time he lay in bed or sat in a chair staring at nothing. Montholon watched the decline with growing alarm. This wasn't natural aging. This was disease. But Napoleon wouldn't listen, wouldn't accept help, wouldn't acknowledge that his body was failing. November 1820. Bertrand's journal entry. His Majesty cannot walk without assistance. His abdomen is greatly swollen. His skin has taken on a yellow cast. His eyes are dull. I fear the end approaches sooner than expected. Napoleon had 16 months left. He didn't know it. October 1820. Brief rally. The pain lessened for 3 days. Napoleon ate a small meal without vomiting. Took a short walk in the garden. Montholon grew hopeful. Perhaps it was passing. Perhaps he'd recover. Napoleon knew better. His voice came quietly without emotion. My body is giving me a moment to prepare. That's all. 3 days later, the pain returned worse than before. January 1821. Napoleon summoned Bertrand, Montholon, and Marchand. He wanted to dictate his will. It took 3 days, interrupted frequently by pain. The opening made his position clear. I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin. Whether he truly believed he'd been poisoned or was making one final propaganda strike was unclear. Perhaps both. He left detailed instructions. Autopsy to determine cause of death. Burial on St. Helena, but with hope his remains would eventually return to France. Distribution of his possessions among loyal followers. The will was witnessed, signed, sealed. 16 months of command reduced to this. Dividing silver plate and camp equipment among 18 people. Napoleon's voice was steady when he finished. I've lived 51 years, been emperor, commanded millions, reshaped Europe, lost everything. I'm ready to rest. But the disease wasn't finished with him yet. February through April 1821. The final deterioration. The pain became constant, sharp, burning, centered in his right side but radiating through his abdomen. Morphine barely touched it. He vomited black bile. Blood, the doctors would say later, his stomach eating itself from the inside. March 25th, he requested Abbe Vignali, made confession, took communion. Whatever his private beliefs, he would die within the church. That mattered, not for salvation, but for history. Dying with last rites meant dying in grace. The legend required it. April 1821. Delirium set in. He spoke in Italian about his childhood in Corsica. Spoke in French, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. Called for Josephine, dead since 1814. The British finally sent Dr. Arnott to examine him. Arnott diagnosed advanced stomach cancer. Prescribed calomel, mercury-based medicine that did nothing except add mercury poisoning to the list of toxins destroying Napoleon's body. May 1st. Napoleon lost consciousness. The vigil began. Bertrand and Montholon took positions on either side of the bed. The others gathered. Servants, soldiers, British observers. 28 people crammed into the small room watching. May 2nd, 3-4. He continued breathing. Shallow, irregular gasps. No consciousness. Just the basic autonomic functions, keeping the body alive while everything else shut down. May 5th, 1821. Dawn, still breathing. The watchers took turns resting, but someone always remained. This was history. When Napoleon Bonaparte died, there would be witnesses. His death would be documented, verified, certified. 11 a.m., still breathing. 2 p.m., still breathing. 5 p.m., the wind outside intensified. Rain hammered the windows. Inside, 28 people stood in silence. The empire had died in Russia in 1812. The emperor ended here in 1821. But what came next would prove more powerful than either. 5:30 p.m., the breathing pattern changed, very shallow now. Long pauses between breaths. 5:45 p.m., everyone unconsciously leaned forward. 5:49 p.m., Napoleon took one final breath, held it, released it slowly. Nothing followed. Dr. Arnott stepped forward, checked for pulse, shook his head, silence for 30 seconds. Then Abbe Vignali began prayers for the dead. The man who'd commanded 70 million was gone at 51 in a converted barn on a rock in the South Atlantic. Outside, rain continued. Wind howled. The sentries paced, unaware the prisoner they'd guarded for 6 years no longer required watching. Inside, 28 people surrounded the body. Some cried, some prayed, some just stared. The British killed the man, but the man had already built the myth. And myths don't need the body to survive. They need people to remember. And people never stop remembering. Within hours, the British would perform an autopsy. Within days, they'd bury him in an unmarked grave. Within months, his companions would scatter, carrying his story across Europe. Within years, that story would reshape how an entire generation understood power, ambition, and the price of greatness. The man was dead. The myth was about to be born, and the myth would prove more powerful than the man ever was. May 6, 1821, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the billiard room at Longwood House. 17 people crowded into the room to witness the autopsy. British doctors, French companions, British officers as official observers. Everyone wanted to see what had killed Napoleon Bonaparte. Dr. Archibald Arnott led the British medical team. Dr. Francesco Antomarchi represented the French household. The political tension was immediate. The British needed an autopsy report that showed natural death. The French needed evidence to support Napoleon's claim of British-inflicted murder. The body lay on the billiard table, covered by a white sheet. Arnott made the first incision. The examination took 4 hours. 17 people watching in silence as Arnott and Antomarchi dissected the body of the man who'd once terrified Europe. The findings were undeniable. A large tumor in the stomach, roughly the size of a hand, had perforated the stomach wall. The surrounding tissue showed extensive ulceration. The stomach lining bore traces of what looked like chemical damage. The liver was enlarged, possibly cirrhotic. Arnott's diagnosis came firmly. Gastric carcinoma, stomach cancer. Antomarchi immediately disputed it. He insisted the liver disease was primary, caused by St. Helena's climate and the stress of imprisonment. The stomach damage was secondary. Montholon interrupted from the back of the room. How do you know it wasn't poison? Arsenic causes stomach ulcers. Everyone knows that. The argument consumed an hour. Arnott maintained professional detachment. Cancer. Clear evidence. No indication of acute poisoning. Antomarchi argued the prolonged exposure to St. Helena's conditions had destroyed Napoleon's health. If not direct poison, then environmental murder. Montholon pressed harder. Test for arsenic. Test the stomach tissue, the liver, anything. Arnott's response was cold. We have no equipment for such tests, and the findings are clear enough. Cancer killed him. They agreed to disagree. Both doctors signed the autopsy report with reservations attached. Arnott, natural death from gastric carcinoma. Antomarchi, death from liver disease caused by imprisonment conditions. Possible poisoning cannot be ruled out. The truth about what killed Napoleon Bonaparte would remain disputed for the next 140 years, and then in 1961 everything would change. But first the mystery deepened. Dr. Arnott gathered tissue samples in sealed jars. Standard procedure. If questions arose later, if accusations of foul play persisted, the British government wanted physical evidence to counter conspiracy theories. Those jars would sit in British archives for decades, forgotten, until a Swedish dentist with an obsession would demand access to Napoleon's hair samples and discover something that would reignite the entire debate. The truth, unknowable in 1821, was probably complicated. Napoleon died primarily from stomach cancer, possibly hereditary. His father had died from stomach problems at 59. But the cancer didn't kill him alone. The arsenic from Longwood's wallpaper, Scheele's green, an arsenic-based pigment that released toxic gas in damp conditions, contributed to his misery. The stress accelerated the disease. The lack of proper medical care for 3 years after O'Mara's expulsion allowed the cancer to progress unchecked. The isolation, the constant psychological warfare with Lowe, the depression, all of it weakened his body's ability to fight. Did Lowe kill Napoleon? Not with poison or a knife, but by denying him proper medical care, by expelling sympathetic doctors, by making every day a battle over petty regulations until Napoleon's body simply gave up. The British would never admit it. The French would never stop claiming it. The truth sat somewhere in between, unsatisfying to everyone. This ambiguity would become part of the legend. The mystery of whether Napoleon was murdered or died naturally would keep people arguing for 2 centuries. And arguments meant attention. Attention meant memory. Memory meant Napoleon won. May 7th through 9. Preparation for burial. Napoleon's body was placed in 4 nested coffins. Tin innermost to preserve the corpse. Mahogany, lead. Mahogany again. The British wanted preservation. If questions arose later about cause of death, they needed the body available for re-examination. The household watched as carpenters sealed each coffin, the sound of hammers on nails echoing through Longwood, each strike driving home the finality. Bertrand supervised every detail. Napoleon had trusted him with this responsibility. The will had been explicit. Proper burial, proper respect, even on this God-forsaken rock. May 9th, 1821. The funeral. A procession formed at Longwood at dawn, the coffin on a hearse pulled by 4 horses. Behind it, Napoleon's horse led by a groom, boots reversed in the stirrups in the cavalry tradition. Behind that, the household members, 17 people now, their faces drawn from 6 years of exile and the final weeks of watching Napoleon die. Behind them, 2,800 British soldiers in dress uniform lining the route. The destination was Seine Valley, also called Valley of the Geraniums, about 2 miles from Longwood. A small spring fed a stand of willow trees. Napoleon had liked the spot during his first months on St. Helena, when he still took walks, before Lowe's regulations and his own declining health imprisoned him at Longwood. 1,500 people attended the funeral. Every British soldier and officer not on duty. Every civilian on the island who could make the journey. Ships' crews from vessels anchored at Jamestown. The service was brief. Catholic rites performed by Abbé Vignali. A British military salute, 19 guns. The salute for a general, not an emperor. The coffin lowered into the ground. Then came the problem of the tombstone. The British governor wanted it to read, Napoleon Bonaparte. Bertrand insisted, Emperor Napoleon. Neither would compromise. The British refused to acknowledge his imperial title even in death. The French refused to deny it. The argument lasted hours. Voices raised. Accusations of dishonor traded back and forth. Finally exhausted, they reached an ugly solution. Leave the grave unmarked. For 19 years, Napoleon's grave would have no name, just blank stone. Visitors would know where he was buried. The spring, the willows. The location wasn't secret, but the grave itself gave no indication who lay beneath. Bertrand stood over the blank stone, fists clenched. This is wrong. Petty and small and wrong. France deserves to bring him home. But Bertrand had no power. None of them did. They were witnesses to indignity, unable to prevent it. The British soldiers marched back to their posts. The household returned to Longwood to begin packing. Their exile was over. Napoleon's was eternal. The household began to disperse within months. Bertrand returned to France in late 1821. He immediately began organizing his journals of the St. Helena years for publication. 6 years of daily observations, Napoleon's conversations, the conflicts with Lowe, the slow deterioration. The journals appeared in 1822 and became immediate bestsellers. French readers devoured accounts of Napoleon's final exile, the British treatment, the petty regulations that had made his life miserable. Bertrand grew wealthy from the publications, bought an estate, lived comfortably until 1844. His loyalty to Napoleon, maintained through 6 years of isolation and indignity, secured his reputation and his fortune. His wife, who'd hated every moment on St. Helena, finally found happiness back in France. She never spoke of the island again. Some prisons you escape by simply refusing to remember. Montholon returned in 1821 as well, published his own memoirs in 1823, which were more dramatic and less reliable than Bertrand's. He portrayed himself as Napoleon's closest confidant in the final years, the trusted advisor who'd held Napoleon's hand as he died. Whether he'd poisoned Napoleon remained a question no one could definitively answer. His behavior during the autopsy, the insistence on testing for arsenic, the loud accusations, could have been genuine concern or masterful misdirection. He inherited significantly from Napoleon's will, enough to live comfortably. If he had poisoned Napoleon, he took the secret to his grave in 1853. Gourgaud, who'd left in 1818, published his journals in 1822. More critical than the others, showing Napoleon's pettiness and cruelty alongside his genius. The tantrums when things didn't go his way. The casual dismissal of people who'd sacrificed everything to follow him, but still sympathetic. Still presenting Napoleon as a tragic figure destroyed by lesser men. Even Gourgaud's bitterness couldn't erase the fundamental truth. Napoleon had been extraordinary, and what the British did to him on St. Helena diminished Britain more than it diminished him. The servants, Marchand, Ali, others, returned to France with small pensions from Napoleon's will. They gave interviews, wrote shorter accounts, contributed to the growing pile of St. Helena literature. Ali the Mamluk, who'd served Napoleon since Egypt, died in poverty in 1840. He'd refused to sell or profit from his connection to Napoleon. Some forms of loyalty don't calculate return, but one account mattered more than all the others combined. Las Caisses' Memorial de Sainte-Hélène appeared in 1823 and changed everything. 8 volumes, thousands of pages of daily conversations, historical analysis, Napoleon's commentary on his campaigns and his reign. The book became the most influential text of the 19th century after the Bible. It was propaganda disguised as historical record. Las Caisses had shaped every conversation to support specific narratives. Napoleon the reformer, Napoleon the champion of merit and progress, Napoleon, the victim of reactionary monarchies, afraid of change. The book portrayed Napoleon as a man who'd spread the Enlightenment at sword point, who'd given Europe the Napoleonic Code, equality under law, careers open to talent, who'd fought to destroy the old order of hereditary privilege, that Napoleon had also crowned himself emperor, reinstated slavery, and killed 3 to 6 million people in his wars. These facts appeared but were buried under avalanches of justification. The deaths were unfortunate necessities. The autocracy was temporary until Europe accepted reform. The wars were defensive, forced upon him by reactionary powers. It was masterful historical revisionism, and it worked. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies across Europe, was translated into every major language, shaped how an entire generation understood Napoleon. Young men across Europe read Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène and learned that one determined man could challenge empires, that merit could triumph over birth, that ideas could be more powerful than armies. Karl Schurz was 14 years old when he read it in 1837 in a small German town. The book changed his life. Napoleon's story, rising from nothing, challenging kings, reshaping Europe through merit, not birth, lit a fire inside him. The idea that one man could matter, that you didn't need noble blood to change history, that revolution was possible. Schurz joined the revolutionary movements of 1848, fought in the German uprisings that swept Europe that year. When they failed, he fled to Switzerland, then France, then America. He became a Union general in the American Civil War, then a U.S. Senator from Missouri, then Secretary of the Interior under President Hayes, spent the rest of his life fighting for civil service reform, for merit-based government appointments, for the principles he'd learned reading about Napoleon. In his memoirs, published in 1906, he credited Napoleon's story as his inspiration. I learned that one man could challenge empires, that birth didn't determine destiny, that ideas could be more powerful than armies. Schurz was one of millions. Across Europe, young men read about Napoleon and joined revolutions. The dead emperor inspired more uprisings than the living one ever had. The British had feared Napoleon would escape St. Helena and restart his wars. They were right to be afraid, but not of physical escape. Napoleon's ideas escaped, and ideas can't be imprisoned. Collectively, these memoirs accomplished exactly what Napoleon intended. They preserved his version of history. They established the martyrdom narrative. They turned 6 years of exile into proof of British cruelty and Napoleon's enduring greatness. Europe's reaction to Napoleon's death split predictably along political lines. In France, royalists celebrated quietly. The Bourbon Restoration was secure. The threat was finally eliminated. King Louis XVIII held a private dinner with close advisors. Champagne was served. Toasts were drunk to the end of Bonapartism. But they celebrated quietly because open celebration would have been dangerous. Napoleon was still beloved by too many. In taverns and cafes across France, veterans gathered. Men who'd fought under Napoleon, who'd marched to Moscow and back, who'd charged at Waterloo. They drank to his memory, told stories of campaigns and victories. They didn't care about the war's costs, the millions dead, the devastation left behind. They remembered the glory. Pierre Vigneault, 72 years old, had been at Austerlitz. He stood in a Paris cafe on May 18, 1821, when news of Napoleon's death arrived. Tears streamed down his weathered face. The words came barely audible. We won everything. We lost everything. But we were glorious. That sentiment spread across France. Grief mixed with pride, mixed with regret. What might have been if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, if he'd stopped after defeating Austria and Prussia, if he'd never invaded Russia. In Britain, relief mixed with grudging respect. He'd been their enemy for 20 years, but he'd been a worthy enemy. The Times ran an obituary that acknowledged his military genius while condemning his ambition. Bonaparte possessed abilities of the first order, but his ambition knew no bounds. He rose higher than any man in modern times and fell further. Austria felt satisfaction. Marie-Louise, Napoleon's second wife and mother of his son, had long since moved on. She'd remarried an Austrian count, Adam von Neipperg, had 3 children with him. When news of Napoleon's death arrived at her estate in Parma, She expressed polite regret and continued with her life. She'd loved Napoleon once, in the way a 19-year-old Habsburg princess could love the conqueror who'd humiliated her family. But that was 11 years ago. She was 30 now with a new family, a new life. Napoleon was the past. Russia and Prussia felt that death was justice. The man who'd invaded their countries, burned their cities, killed their soldiers, had finally faced consequences. Tsar Alexander III held a memorial service, oddly enough. Not celebration, but acknowledgement that a great enemy had fallen. But across Europe, among liberals, romantics, and revolutionaries, Napoleon's death transformed him into something more dangerous than he'd ever been alive. Dead, he became a symbol. The man who'd risen from nothing to reshape Europe. The man who'd proven merit could triumph over birth. The man who challenged kings and almost won. Publishers across Europe released memoirs, histories, analyses, tributes. Artists painted dramatic scenes of Napoleon's campaigns, the crossing of the Alps, the victory at Austerlitz, the burning of Moscow, the death on St. Helena. Composers wrote symphonies inspired by his victories and his fall. Napoleon dead became more famous than Napoleon exiled. His legend grew untethered from the complicated reality of his actual reign. The irony would have pleased him, 1821 through 1840. 19 years. Napoleon's grave sat unmarked on St. Helena. The willow trees grew. The spring continued flowing. Ships stopped occasionally, and curious visitors walked to San Valley to see where the great Bonaparte was buried. The British government occasionally discussed returning the remains to France, but always decided against it. Too much risk of creating a rallying point for French nationalism. France under the Bourbon Restoration tried to erase Napoleon from public memory, censored newspapers that praised him, blocked publication of favorable biographies, discouraged veterans from wearing their medals or discussing campaigns. But you can't erase what people remember. Veterans told stories. Publishers in Belgium and Switzerland, beyond French censorship, sold books. Artists created paintings. The legend grew despite official attempts to suppress it. The July Revolution of 1830 changed everything. 3 days of street fighting in Paris overthrew Charles IX and the Bourbon monarchy. The revolutionaries installed Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orléans, as constitutional monarch under a more liberal regime. The new government was less afraid of Napoleon's memory, saw potential benefit in associating with his legend. Glory, French greatness. The idea that France could dominate Europe again. By 1840, enough time had passed. Enough veterans had died. Enough distance existed between Napoleon's actual reign and the romanticized memory. The French government under Louis-Philippe decided to bring Napoleon home. Partly politics. The July monarchy needed legitimacy. Associating with Napoleon's glory helped. Partly genuine sentiment. Napoleon represented French greatness. His remains belonged in France, not on a British rock in the Atlantic. October 1840, the frigate La Belle Poule departed France for St. Helena. The mission? Retrieve Napoleon's remains and bring them home with full honors. The crew included Prince de Joinville, King Louis-Philippe's third son, military officers, officials, diplomats. This wasn't just a retrieval mission. This was a state ceremony stretched across 2 oceans. October 15th, 1840. La Belle Poule anchored at Jamestown, exactly 25 years to the day since Napoleon had arrived as a prisoner. The symmetry was almost too perfect, as if history itself had a sense of dramatic timing. The British government cooperated fully. Governor Middlemore welcomed the French delegation. Arrangements were made. The exhumation would occur immediately. St. Helena had served its purpose. Keeping Napoleon's grave there now looked petty rather than necessary. Better to let him go and be done with it. October 15th, 1840. Night. The exhumation. British and French officials gathered at Seine Valley by torchlight. The scene looked medieval. Dancing shadows, the sound of shovels on earth, the smell of damp soil and willows. Workers removed the blank tombstone carefully. It would be preserved as a relic, proof of British pettiness. They dug down through earth. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. The sound of shovels hitting wood. General Gourgaud, who'd served under Napoleon and left St. Helena in bitterness in 1818, attended the exhumation. He'd returned to France, published his critical but sympathetic journals. and never stopped regretting how things had ended. Now he stood in darkness, watching workers unearth Napoleon's coffins, and 22 years of complicated feelings overwhelmed him. The workers lifted the outermost mahogany coffin. Heavy, 4 men struggling with the weight. Inside, the lead coffin showed greenish corrosion where moisture had seeped through over 19 years. They pried it open carefully. The scraping of metal on metal set teeth on edge. Inside that, the inner mahogany coffin, damaged badly, wood soft with moisture and time. Inside that, the tin coffin. This was the seal that had preserved everything. Workers cut through the tin seal, a soft hiss as air pressure equalized after 19 years. The lid lifted. Silence. Napoleon's face. 19 years underground, and still recognizable. The skin waxy but intact. The uniform, the green uniform of the chasseurs of the guard, still holding color. The hands crossed on the chest exactly as they'd been positioned in 1821. A small silver crucifix rested on his chest. Gourgaud's vision blurred. He tasted salt, tears. He'd last seen this face alive in 1818 when he'd left St. Helena angry and bitter, feeling betrayed. Now he was weeping. Around him, French officers and sailors stood in silence, some crying openly, some staring, all trying to comprehend that the man who'd commanded them was still here, still somehow present after 2 decades in the ground. One French officer reached out, touched Napoleon's hand through the coffin opening, then pulled back, shocked at his own impulse. General Bertrand's son Henri attended representing his father, who died in 1844. Henri was 11 when his family had departed St. Helena in 1821. He'd grown up on stories of the exile, the suffering, his father's unwavering loyalty. Now he looked down at Napoleon's preserved face and broke down sobbing. They transferred the body to a new ebony coffin with extraordinary care. Like moving something sacred, the old tin coffin would be preserved. The uniform left exactly as it was. The new coffin was sealed and carried to La Belle Poule. October 18, 1840. La Belle Poule departed St. Helena. The voyage home took 2 months. The ship traveled slowly, respectfully, as if carrying not just remains, but the weight of history itself. December 15, 1840, the return. La Belle Poule anchored at Cherbourg. Napoleon's coffin was transferred to a river barge for the journey up the Seine to Paris. Word had spread across France. Napoleon was coming home. December 15th. Paris, morning. Over 1 million people lined the streets. More than had witnessed his coronation in 1804. More than had watched any event in French history. Veterans of the Grand Army, now in their 60s and 70s, arrived in Paris from across France. They wore old uniforms that no longer fit, tailored for bodies 30 years younger, for men who hadn't yet survived Russia or Leipzig or Waterloo. They stood along the Champs-Élysées, silent, waiting. The procession began at 11 a.m. First came military bands playing funeral marches, then cavalry units in full-dress uniform, then infantry formations, thousands of soldiers. Then the hearse. It was massive, gold and purple, drawn by 16 horses, the coffin visible through glass panels, draped in purple velvet with gold bees, Napoleon's imperial symbol. The crowd stood silent except for quiet weeping. No cheers, no celebration. This wasn't a triumph. This was grief and memory and recognition of everything that had been lost. An elderly man in the tattered uniform of the Imperial Guard collapsed as the hearse passed. His companions caught him, held him up. He was crying too hard to stand. A woman held up her infant son to see the procession. "Remember this," she whispered. "Remember you saw the emperor come home." The procession moved slowly through Paris, down the Champs-Élysées, around the Place de la Concorde where Louis XVI had been guillotined during the Revolution, across the Seine. It took hours. Veterans stood and wept. They'd survived when 645,000 hadn't. They'd made it home from Russia, from Leipzig, from Waterloo. They'd outlived their emperor, and now they were watching him return in a coffin. What had it all been for? The wars, the deaths, the glory? Pierre Vigneault, now 91, stood on the Champs-Élysées leaning heavily on a cane. He'd been at Austerlitz. He'd seen Napoleon at the peak of his power. Now he watched the coffin pass and whispered the same words he'd said in 1821. We won everything. We lost everything. But we were glorious. That was all that remained. The memory of glory, the knowledge that they'd been part of something larger than themselves, even if it had ended in disaster. The procession reached Les Invalides, the military complex with its golden dome, at dusk. The massive dome gleamed in the fading light. The building had been commissioned by Louis XIV in 1670 as a hospital for wounded soldiers. Now it would become Napoleon's final resting place. The coffin was carried into the church through massive bronze doors. The interior was draped in black and gold. Thousands of candles, the scent of incense. The ceremony was magnificent. All of France's political and military elite attended. King Louis Philippe himself delivered the eulogy, praising Napoleon's military genius and administrative reforms while carefully avoiding mention of the costs. But the real ceremony was outside, in the streets, where veterans stood and remembered, where ordinary French citizens tried to understand what Napoleon had meant, why they'd followed him, why they'd forgiven him, why they still loved him despite everything. The coffin was placed in a temporary vault while the permanent tomb was constructed. That would take 21 years. But Napoleon was home. The permanent tomb took until 1861 to complete. The design was extraordinary. The architect, Louis Visconti, created something between a tomb and a temple. You enter Les Invalides through the main entrance, walk through galleries of military history. Then you reach the dome chamber, and you descend. 12 massive stone pillars surround a circular space. Between the pillars, statues representing Napoleon's victories. Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram. Others, inscriptions listing his achievements, the Napoleonic Code, the Concordat with Rome, the Bank of France, the educational reforms, the infrastructure projects. No mention of the millions dead. No mention of the countries invaded. No mention of the republics overthrown. No mention of the slaves re-enslaved. Just glory, just achievement. Just the legend Napoleon had carefully constructed during those 6 years at Longwood. In the center, on a green granite pedestal, sits the tomb. Red quartzite from Finland, so dark it's almost purple. Enormous, over 13 feet long, 6.5 feet wide, 14.5 feet tall. You look down at it from the gallery above. The design forces you into that position, looking down as if paying homage to something divine. The effect is overwhelming. The sheer scale, the beauty, the weight of history pressing down from the dome above. This is where Napoleon rested on the banks of the Seine, among the French people he'd loved. He got his wish, 20 years late, but he got it. Today, Les Invalides attracts roughly 1.5 million visitors annually, more than most living heads of state receive in their lifetimes. Marcus Chen, 29, a software engineer from Singapore, descended the steps into Les Invalides crypt on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2023. He'd learned about Napoleon from a YouTube video that had gone viral. 2 hours of storytelling that had made him book a trip to Paris just to see the tomb. The crypt was stunning. The massive pillars, that enormous red quartzite sarcophagus, the sense of descending into something sacred, into a space designed to inspire awe. Marcus stood at the railing, looking down at the tomb. An elderly French couple stood nearby. The woman was weeping quietly. Her husband held her hand. Marcus overheard their conversation in French. His rudimentary understanding caught fragments. He gave France glory. He killed millions. He spread the code. Equality under law. He crowned himself emperor and crushed republics. He made France matter. He destroyed a generation. They were both right. Marcus took out his phone, snapped a photo, posted it to Instagram with the caption, "Came to see Napoleon's tomb. Learned that history is more complicated than any video can capture." 300 likes within an hour. 20 comments, half praising Napoleon, half condemning him. Even in death, even 202 years later, Napoleon divided people. Marcus walked back up the steps into sunlight, mind spinning. He still didn't know what to think about Napoleon. Genius or tyrant, Hero or villain, victim or perpetrator. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the ones who remain interesting are the ones who refuse to be simple. Napoleon's legacy extends far beyond that tomb. The Napoleonic Code forms the basis of civil law in over 70 countries. France, obviously, but also Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, parts of Germany, Louisiana in the United States, Quebec in Canada, much of Latin America, parts of Africa and the Middle East. The principles Napoleon codified in 1804 remain standard: equality before the law, secular authority, property rights, individual freedom, religious tolerance. Revolutionary concepts in 1804. Basic civil rights today. Military academies worldwide still study Napoleon's campaigns, his tactics, his strategies, his mistakes. The core system allowing independent unit operation, combined arms coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery, living off the land for supply, central position strategy to defeat enemies one by one. Maneuver warfare, prioritizing movement over frontal assault, concepts he pioneered or perfected that remain fundamental to modern military doctrine. His name became synonymous with ambition, with the rise and fall of great men, with the costs of hubris. Napoleon complex entered psychology as a term for overcompensation driven by perceived inadequacy. The Napoleon of X became shorthand for dominance in any field. The Napoleon of finance, the Napoleon of tech, the Napoleon of chess. His legend outlasted the British Empire that imprisoned him, outlasted the Bourbon monarchy that replaced him, outlasted most of the states he conquered. Hudson Lowe died in 1844, largely forgotten except as the man who guarded Napoleon. He spent his final years defending his treatment of the prisoner, published a 500-page justification of his actions at St. Helena, wrote letters to newspapers, argued he'd simply followed orders, enforced necessary regulations, done his duty. History didn't care. Lowe is remembered as the petty tyrant in Napoleon's martyrdom story, the jailer, the villain, the small-minded bureaucrat who couldn't see he was creating exactly what he'd been trying to prevent. The British government's strategy failed completely. They'd wanted to exile Napoleon somewhere remote, contain him until natural death, avoid making him a martyr. They controlled his body. He controlled his story. And in the end, the story mattered more. But here's the pattern Napoleon proved that still matters in 2024. You cannot destroy someone's legacy by controlling their body. St. Helena was 1,200 miles from anywhere. No telegraph, no telephone, no internet, just ships that took months to reach Europe. Yet information escaped. Letters reached Paris and London. Expelled companions published accounts. News of British treatment spread across Europe, despite all attempts to contain it. Napoleon shaped his narrative from that converted barn, dictated memoirs that would reshape how millions understood power, merit, and revolution, turned every British restriction into ammunition for a propaganda war the British Empire couldn't counter. If Napoleon could do it in 1821 with nothing but pen and paper and expelled companions carrying his story, how much harder is it now to control narratives in an age of instant global communication? The pattern repeats. Constantly. February 16, 2024. Moscow. Funeral of Alexei Navalny. Thousands brave police presence to pay respects to Vladimir Putin's most prominent opponent. Dead in an Arctic prison at age 47 under suspicious circumstances. Russian authorities tried to control everything. Delayed releasing the body. Restricted funeral attendance, blocked media coverage, arrested people laying flowers, failed completely. Video spread instantly across social media, photos of thousands gathering despite threats. International condemnation. Navalny's final message recorded before his death, viewed millions of times. If they've killed me, it means we were strong enough to frighten them. The Russian government poisoned Navalny in 2020, Novichok nerve agent, survived only through emergency treatment in Germany, imprisoned him on fabricated charges in 2021, denied him proper medical care, moved him to increasingly harsh prisons, made his life systematically miserable, exactly the pattern Lowe followed with Napoleon, February 2024. Navalny died under conditions the Russian government never adequately explained, just like Napoleon died under conditions the British never adequately explained. Within weeks, a documentary about Navalny won an Academy Award. His widow continued his work. His organization, though officially dissolved, continued operating from exile. His final message became a rallying cry for Russian opposition. The Russian government tried to erase Navalny. Instead, they created a martyr. 203 years after Napoleon proved the pattern. It still works exactly the same way. The pattern is simple. Powerful entities try to destroy enemies through legal means while maintaining plausible deniability. Exile that's technically humane, but psychologically destructive. Imprisonment on charges that are technically legal, but politically motivated. Denial of medical care that's technically within regulations, but functionally lethal. Systematic humiliation that doesn't qualify as torture, but destroys people just as effectively. Napoleon proved you can't control someone's legacy through physical control. You need to control their story, and stories escape. Navalny proved the pattern still holds. Julian Assange's treatment proves it. Edward Snowden's exile proves it. The pattern repeats throughout history, across cultures, in different political systems. Legacy is the revenge of the defeated on the victors. Napoleon lost every physical battle after Russia, lost his throne, lost his freedom, lost his life, but he won the memory war. And memory is the only battlefield where victory lasts forever. Contemporary historians see Napoleon as complex and contradictory, not simple hero or simple villain, but both simultaneously. Achievements. He stabilized post-revolutionary France after a decade of chaos, created an enduring legal framework that spread equality under law across Europe, promoted meritocracy over hereditary privilege, reformed education, creating the lycée system that still exists, built infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, spread Enlightenment ideals of rational government. Crimes. He started or continued wars that killed 3 to 6 million people. Soldiers, civilians, entire villages burned, families destroyed. He overthrew republics he claimed to defend, the Italian republics, the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, reinstated slavery in French colonies in 1802, 8 years after the revolution had abolished it, because sugar plantations were profitable and he needed money for wars. Ruled as an autocrat despite revolutionary rhetoric, suppressed dissent systematically, censored newspapers, imprisoned critics, created a police state. The question becomes, can you separate achievement from atrocity? Can Napoleon's legal code justify his wars? Can his promotion of merit excuse his tyranny? Can his military genius offset the millions dead? There's no clean answer, which is exactly why the debate continues 2 centuries later. Napoleon's wars killed 3 to 6 million people. That's roughly the population of Maryland and Virginia combined. Gone for one man's ambition. The 645,000 who died in Russia, that's more than American combat deaths in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the entire War on Terror combined, in 6 months, for one campaign that achieved nothing. When he died on St. Helena, isolated and humiliated, was that justice? Maybe. The case for justice. Traditional punishment for defeated tyrants is execution. The British spared his life, gave him a house, servants, food, the chance to live naturally until disease took him. The case for cruelty. 6 years of systematic humiliation, daily inspections like a criminal, movement restrictions, correspondence censorship, budget limitations forcing him to sell possessions, denied proper title, denied proper medical care after O'Mara's expulsion, living in damp, toxic conditions with arsenic-laden wallpaper, constant surveillance, psychological warfare over petty regulations. Both are true. Napoleon deserved punishment for the millions dead, the republics destroyed, the wars of conquest disguised as liberation. But the British didn't execute him. They destroyed him slowly, systematically, with bureaucratic precision. That's arguably worse. It's calculated, deliberate, and maintains an appearance of civility while inflicting systematic psychological torture. This became the template. Destroy someone, while keeping your hands technically clean. Guantanamo Bay. Prisoners held without trial for decades. Enhanced interrogation. That's technically not torture. Legal, clean, deniable. Black sites, secret prisons, extraordinary rendition. All conducted within legal frameworks carefully constructed to provide cover. Political imprisonment worldwide. Navalny in Russia, Uyghurs in China, countless others. Legal charges, fair trials in name only. Conditions that systematically break people without qualifying as abuse. The pattern Napoleon experienced, powerful entities destroying enemies through legal means while maintaining plausibility, continues. And it continues to fail at the one thing it's designed to achieve: controlling the narrative. Because Napoleon was right about one thing. You can imprison a body, you can't imprison a story. So here we are, 203 years after Napoleon died in that converted barn. His tomb at Les Invalides attracts 1.5 million visitors annually. His legal code governs 70 countries. His military tactics are still studied. His name is still spoken. And the debate over what he meant still rages. Was he a tyrant? Yes. Was he a genius? Yes. Did he kill millions? Yes. Did he spread ideas that liberated millions? Also yes. Great men do terrible things. Terrible men do great things. Napoleon was both. And that's what makes him impossible to forget and impossible to forgive. The British thought they'd contained him by exiling him to St. Helena. They controlled his body. He controlled his story. And in the end, the story mattered more. From that damp room at Longwood, Napoleon dictated memoirs that would reshape how an entire generation understood power, merit, and revolution. From that prison, he won a propaganda war that the British Empire with all its resources couldn't counter. He lost every physical battle left after Russia, but he won the memory war. And memory is the only battlefield where victory is permanent. 2 centuries later, we're still talking about him, still arguing about him, still trying to understand how one man from Corsica conquered Europe, lost everything, and died on a rock in the Atlantic, yet somehow won. The answer is uncomfortable. Legacy is the revenge of the defeated on the victors, and Napoleon understood legacy better than any commander in history. He commanded 70 million Europeans and died with 28 witnesses. But today, millions know his name. Millions visit his tomb. Millions debate his meaning. Students study his campaigns. Nations use his legal code. His story inspires revolutions and reforms. He lost everything and won the only thing that lasts. Whether he deserved to is the question that will never die. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted: to be remembered, to be debated, to force every generation to confront the question, what does it mean to be great? What's the price of ambition? Where's the line between genius and monstrosity? Napoleon never gets to answer. He's been dead for 203 years. But we keep asking. And as long as we keep asking, he keeps winning. From 70 million to 28. From 28 to immortality. The man who could survive anything except irrelevance made sure he'd never be irrelevant, even from a grave.